For more on Malaysia's GE15, we're joined by Professor of Political Science from University at Albany, Dr. Meredith Weiss. Dr. Weiss is also a visiting senior fellow at RSIS and is speaking to us from Kuala Terengganu. Now, Dr. Weiss, as we heard from our correspondent to FIFA there, race-based politics is still very much part of Malaysia's elections, and any coalition looking to win this election is going to need to win the Malay vote.
Correct. The challenge, though, is that there are multiple parties vying for that very same Malay vote. So that complicates matters.
Professor, Malaysian politics is distinct in that pre-election coalitions dominate rather than parties. At this point, is any one coalition a front-runner, even slightly? And how significant are regional coalitions in Sarawak and Sabah?
On the peninsula, Pakatan Harapan seems to have the edge, but this is a coalition that's expecting to get probably no more than 15 to 20% of the Malay vote. So even though it would be a frontrunner and will almost certainly be part of a government, it's unlikely to have the legitimacy to lead the government on its own, even if it could come close to a simple majority. So that complicates matters quite a bit, in as much as it's likely to need to form a coalition with a party with a stronger Malay base to make for a stronger governing premise. That said, as you noted, there are these regional coalitions, GPS and GRS in particular, in Sabah and Sarawak, respectively. And those two tend to lean toward the incumbent government, which has been Barisan Nasional most of the time. It's not clear to whom they might throw their support this time. They've been quite strategically holding back that decision. So they could be kingmakers in that sense, but really any alternative partner would be a kingmaker.
Leading up to GE15, Malaysian media reported that there might be a big tent strategy, if you like, by the coalitions of Pakatan Harapan, led by Anwar Ibrahim, Perikatan Nasional, led by Muhyiddin Yassin, and Gerakan Tanah Air, led by Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, to work together to block Barisan Nasional from winning the upcoming polls. Does that look likely?
I think it's actually getting less likely, in part because it seems that it might be less necessary than previously. So the premise was this anything but UMNO idea for, as you note, a big tent, including every party or every coalition except the BN. It won't, I think, given current polling, be required that Pakatan or other partners bring in absolutely everyone in order to keep out BN. And it may well be that the BN forms a coalition with Perikatan Nasional instead. So there have been some ventures on both sides, actually on all sides. There are all sorts of discussions underway, but some ventures toward that more Malay-based PN-BN coalition that could bring in a Sarawak-Sabah coalition as well to form the government and shut out PH. The issue is that the vote could well be so sufficiently split that we really have multiple different options, some including a bigger tent than others.
Lots of moving parts here. Coalitions have always been a part of Malaysia's political history. Some observers, though, saying that the coalition party system just isn't working and that coalition members should possibly dissolve, set up a new multiracial party to put an end to race-based politics. What's your assessment of that?
I don't think setting up a new non-racial party would be the solution. Malaysia has tried that. It hasn't really solved things. We have multiracial parties in coalition with race-based parties or with other multiracial parties. There is, though, still the matter of the coalitions that themselves are really not functioning as they used to. So we have coalitions that are registered as parties, so that would be BN or PH, for instance, but that compete conjointly, even though members still have party loyalties to their specific party. So it could well be that we see a fracturing of the pre-set coalitions. We're already hearing some murmurings about, for instance, that the BN might ally with PAS, but not with Bersatu, so splitting Perikatan Nasional. Perikatan Nasional has said that they are not open to that idea, but all things are possible. And so it could well be that we do have some further fragmentation of the coalitions with re-scrambling the existing parties amongst them after the election or before the next election.
For decades, Dr. Weiss, Malaysia's seen or regularly seen politicians jumping from one party to another. A new anti-party hopping law has been put in place to stop this at the upcoming election. That should bring some stability to party and coalition makeup, so shouldn't it?
It should bring stability to party makeup, but not to coalition makeup, because parties themselves can still hop from one coalition to another. And that is very much a possibility shortly after the election, I would think. On the one hand, for the other coalitions, the DAP within Pakatan Harapan is the red line agreement that they wouldn't cross to ally with them. For others, for instance, within UMNO, I've heard really strong statements against aligning with Bersatu as ex-UMNO hoppers. Should there be a post-election coalition with part of Perikatan, it's certainly not certain that those coalitions would break up, but parties as a whole may still hop. And the larger issue of a lack of party differentiation and of multiple parties that really look to voters very much the same remains. So even though we may not see the same sort of, I hope we don't see the same sort of post-coalition party hopping that we had last time, thanks to the anti-hopping law, that doesn't really mean that candidates will remain party loyal. So it could be that before the next election, general election, or even before a by-election, we could well see some movement among candidates who got sidelined. We've already seen some of that for this election. Candidates who were dropped from the nominees for one party who simply went to stand for, instead of UMNO, for PAS, for instance.
And a lot of talk, Professor, around the youth vote this time around, some 6 million new voters on the roll this time. How do you think they are going to perceive these coalitions? Do they look at the coalitions or the parties or the individuals? Do we know?
We know a bit. So, and I should clarify that the 6 million new voters, most of them are not youth voters, though about a third of Malaysian voters are youth. So it's still a large share. A good proportion of the voters introduced with the Undi 18, the amendment that reduced the voting age from 21 to 18, were through the other part of the amendment, which introduced automatic registration of voters. The youth vote is extraordinarily hard to predict for two key reasons. One, we have no history of turnout among them because they're first-time voters with which to temper survey findings. So in other words, most people will over-report on surveys their inclination or their expectation that they'll vote. For other communities, for older constituencies, older cohorts, it's possible for us to say, here's what they predicted last time that they would do, here's what actually happened. We can't do that for first-time voters, and we do know that in state elections, for instance, Johor, it was the youngest voters that had the lowest level of turnout. That's actually not unusual in comparative terms. At the last GE, though, the youth vote was slightly higher than the overall vote turnout. So we're not quite sure what to expect in that regard. The second reason is that survey results so far before the election have shown, and this still seems to be the case, a lower level of party loyalty among first-time voters or voters under the age of 30, some of whom may have voted once before, which makes it more difficult to predict what they'll actually lean toward as a default, even if, for instance, they're not differentiating among manifestos or anything like that. So far, it appears that the individual candidate may have quite a high level of sway among youth voters, but actually also among other voters to a greater extent than previously, if only because instead of a two-way Pakatan Harapan or BN, those are your choices, split, now we have a three-way split. So voters, we think overall, will be looking more at who is the individual standing under each of the three major coalitions in their constituency.
All right. Thank you very much for your insights and for making the time for us today. That was Dr. Meredith Weiss, Professor of Political Science from the University at Albany and visiting senior fellow at RSIS. And we apologize for that audio breakup there.